today I'm going to focus in more specifically on the work I'm doing in the area of adaptation to climate change, and specifically climate change-driven stressors in forest systems. The system that I focus on is the temperate forest biome, and although I collaborate and co-author manuscripts and do stuff with people who work in many areas in the temperate forest biome across the world, my empirical research is located in the United States, and specifically in the Pacific Northwest in dry forest systems, where climate change is interacting with conditions that are really legacies of past land use to create conditions for very flammable, for large fires in the future. So climate change models are projecting an increase in the suitability of forest conditions for very large fires over the next 100 years. So I've been focusing in that area and looking at individual adaptation to increasing wildfire risk in the interior Pacific Northwest. But since I've moved to Michigan, I've taken advantage of the geographic opportunity to focus a little bit more in the upper Midwest, where global change and climate change are interacting with local forest conditions to exacerbate some of the disturbance processes that have historically been part of these systems. So storms, droughts, heat waves, insect and disease outbreaks, winter thaws. These are being exacerbated by global climate change with outcomes for many of the values that people derive for forests. And just an example, some climate models project that sugar maple, a species that many of us value highly, may disappear from Michigan and Wisconsin by 2100. So as much as possible, I try to take a social ecological systems approach in my work. This is a figure that Inez Ibanez and I developed for a project that we're just starting to work on together, where I'm really interested in working with forest ecologists and climate scientists to understand how climate is going to affect forest systems by creating stressors or disturbances or severe events that in turn influence people's experiences of forests, their perceptions of risk, the norms under which they manage forests. Also, in some cases, stressors that challenge people's knowledge of forest systems and their perceptions of their own capacity to manage those systems under current rules and regulations and markets, with outcomes for their behavior that in turn shape forest conditions and processes. So my research questions, kind of building on that, are severalfold. One of them is, how do forest managers respond to local risks from global climate change? I'm really interested in taking more disciplined approaches to characterizing people's responses in terms of adaptation and coping. Adaptation is more of a long-term process of undertaking behavioral adjustments in anticipation of future change, drawing on resources and information that are held collectively, whereas coping is generally considered more of a reactive, kind of short-term effort to reduce immediate impact. So I'm interested in classifying people's behavioral responses to climate change along that spectrum of adaptation and coping. I'm also really interested in understanding more about how people form perceptions of risk and how their perceptions of risk interact with their perceptions of their own capacity to respond, shaping their behavioral responses. In the case of climate change, where some of these stressors unfold over long periods of time, across large spatial extents, and involve a lot of uncertainty, in some cases it's really difficult for people to observe and definitely make sense of those changes. And so a balance between risk perception and the perception that one can do something about it is really important. In the case of the California fires, that may have overwhelmed some people's perceptions that they were able to do anything about some of these local impacts of global change. I'm also very interested in the role of social networks in people's responses and how the information that people gather through their interactions in networks amplify or attenuate their perceptions of risk or their appraisals of their own ability to respond. And then finally, what are the implications of the responses for forest conditions and processes, closing that loop. In terms of my methods, this is the same slide I presented a couple weeks ago, different color, but I generally try to work with stakeholders at different points through my process, identifying research questions, refining those questions, interpreting results. I really enjoy qualitative methods, so using interviews and focus groups and analyzing those data to identify variables and potential relationships among variables. And then I usually follow up or incorporate some sort of quantitative analysis where I'm using something like a mail survey to test hypotheses that emerged. And then finally, In terms of teaching, I teach a topics class. It's about vulnerability and adaptation, so frameworks for assessing vulnerability and evaluating whether and how adaptation is occurring, and then 3 different half-term methods courses, so about qualitative data collection, qualitative data analysis, and stakeholder network analysis. Thank you very much.